Okay, here we go. So, well, welcome everybody to this evening's CILT US chapter forum talk. It's on the state of North America's freight railroad industry. I'm pleased to introduce Jay Shabat, who's our guest speaker tonight. Jay, I'll let you actually give a little bit of background about yourself. All I will say is I think the timing is quite impressive for having a talk about the freight rail industry. Bearing in mind it's probably a topic that's in the first or second item on the news for the last week or so. So I know, Jay, we're not going to just be focusing on one particular incident. This is an industry-wide view. So I'm delighted to hand over to you, and I've kind of used about 10 minutes up, so the rest of the time is all yours, sir. Please, though, if anybody has any questions for Jay, add those onto the chat function, and we'll come to those with time before the end of the session.
Okay, Andrew, thank you very much, and I assume you can hear me okay? Any
yes.
Issues? Okay, very good. Okay, well, yeah, Andrew, thank you so much, and thank all of you for attending this evening or this afternoon. I'm not sure where everybody is, probably spread across the continent, perhaps even beyond the continent. But thanks. Yeah, I think we've got an interesting discussion to have tonight about the North American railroad industry. So I guess Andrew asked me to introduce myself a little bit. So my name is Jay Shabat. My actual kind of primary sort of coverage or something that I've been doing for really 20 years is actually researching, reporting, writing about the airline business. So I'm relatively new to railroads. I've been doing this for about 2 years on the railroad side, and I am focused on primarily the commercial aspects of these transportation industries. So not so much operations, not so much really anything beyond just things like finance and strategy and corporate, just the commercial aspects. So as we go through this, you'll see I'll be talking about a lot of that kind of stuff. Obviously, be welcome to you all are welcome to ask whatever questions you would like, but just keep that in mind that there are certain aspects of the industry, particularly on the operational side, that I am completely unqualified to answer. Now, we may have people on this call that, by all means, if anybody has anything that they'd like to add, by all means, you're welcome to do that. So obviously, as Andrew mentioned, and I'm in New Jersey, by the way. I don't know if anybody cares or wants to know, but I'm always curious where people actually are. I'm in New Jersey, about halfway between New York and Philadelphia. So as Andrew mentioned, the railroads have been in the news. Unfortunately, the railroads, it's different than the airlines. With the airlines are always in the news because it's a very consumer-focused business. We all travel and we go to the airport, we suffer the delays. So there's a lot of just the freight railroad industry operates, of course, more in the background. However, we've had sort of 2 instances this year where railroads have been sort of, front page news, and it's unfortunately for not very good reasons. I mean, we had earlier, or let's say late last year, we had the whole situation with the labor, the labor strife between the, they're trying to reach a contract. It was a 5-year deal, and it took them like 2 or 3 years to reach the contract. So it came down to Congress. It was just a very, kind of tense negotiation, and a very, drawn out one that almost resulted in a strike. I mean, it came very, very close. So, you would turn on the nightly news, or maybe I'm dating myself. Nobody watches nightly news anymore, do they? But, you pick up your iPad and you look at the news, and it's, railroads front and center. Now, of course, and I just sort of added this slide, we have this situation here in Ohio with the Norfolk Southern incident. And like I said, I mean, I'm not I know I don't have any background in operations or safety, so I can't really, there's nothing I can really add to what you guys probably already know. But obviously it's something that's front and center. Interestingly, I was a little bit surprised, but Norfolk Southern actually. So there's been this week, there's been several investor conferences where, and these are typical, every quarter, the railroads, all these, big public companies, they'll report their financial results. And then in subsequent weeks, and then, 3, 4, 5 weeks afterwards, the big Wall Street banks and the Bay Street banks in Canada, JP Morgan or Barclays, whatever, they'll hold these investor events and they'll invite the CEOs or the CFOs to come speak. And there was a bunch of those this week. In fact, just before this call, I listened to one from CSX, their new CEO presented. I was a little bit surprised that actually Norfolk Southern presented as well this week at, I can't remember if it was Barclays or one of the bank conferences. They didn't say a whole lot about this incident, other than, what you'd expect them to say. Now, the CEO wasn't there. He was actually, on site in Ohio. The CFO, the finance officer, the marketing officer as well was there. And, just as you'd expect, just clarifying that, they're very concerned about safety and they're willing to, they're always number one priority, and, commitment to invest whatever's, necessary. There are a couple of things, and I don't want to spend too long on this again, because not my area of expertise, but there are a couple interesting kind of discussions that are swirling around now about, what is this ultimately going to cost? And I'm talking, from the business perspective, what is this ultimately going to cost Norfolk Southern? Will it result in more regulation? And you hear, a lot of the railroad executives kind of addressing that question a lot too. So I'm going to move on from that. And if it comes up later on, that's fine. But just so you know, that's why I'm moving through it pretty quickly. It's not my, background. So what I am going to start with then is talk a little bit about railroad history. And I know some of you are, having flashbacks of high school history class here, but don't worry, I'm not, going to go through each and every one of these points. And I promise there's not going to be a quiz. But I just wanted to go through this because to me, I think railroad history is just so absolutely fascinating. I mean, I'm interested in American history. It was always a subject I liked in school and stuff. I like to read books about, especially economic history. And I just find this industry just so interesting because ever since railroads started, and it was about like, the 1820s was really when the first ones came to the US, when they first started developing. And just after that, particularly, in the decades leading up to the Civil War, and then especially in the decades after the Civil War, it just completely reshaped, these railroads completely reshaped the economy. For one, I listed a couple of things here. They created a unified national market. So now, if you're, a factory in Nebraska, you can easily sell things to someone in Georgia, because now you had actually means of transporting your goods. Markets used to be, much more local. So that aspect in itself is very interesting. And then if you think about just the way corporations are organized today, with you have accountants and lawyers and chief financial officers, and it's just kind of have a modern bureaucracy, what you think of as a corporation. A lot of that started with the railroads. I mean, they just became these giant organizations that just had to be managed differently than anything that came before them. And that aspect of the history is interesting too. And then everywhere kind of the railroads went, they created these new cities and new towns. I mean, you just look at a US map today and pretty much anything in the West, a lot of the South. I mean, all of these towns, they really exist because the original reasons, because the railroad passed through there. I mean, a place like Atlanta or, Denver, just to name two, big Dallas. I mean, they're places that, really took off when the railroad came to town. And that sort of gave these places an ability to develop whatever it might be, in Dallas, the cotton trade or whatever, it revolutionized the economy of these places. Now, very specifically to the railroads, this was very much true in the 19th century. It's still to some extent, to a large extent true today, that railroads have a very, very close relationship with steel companies and coal mines. If you think about, the industrialization of America, and again, I don't want to, sorry if I'm sounding like a, seventh grade history teacher here, but the industrialization of America, you remember like Carnegie and the steel mills and all that kind of stuff. I mean, a lot of that product was transported to market by the railroads, and the railroads were also the customers for that market too, because, to build the rail cars and to build the rails themselves, I mean, you needed just so much steel. So they really participated and became central players in the industrial development of the U.S. economy, which I always find very interesting. And then, coal too. And we'll probably get to this slide a little later, but coal is, very much even today, the number one product that railroads carry. So I find that very interesting. And then, I won't go through all these slides here. In World War I, actually, the railroads were actually nationalized during the war, and then they were returned to the private sector. But by that time, I mean, shortly after, let's say, I don't know, probably, I guess it would be shortly after World War I, kind of in that general area, we're talking about early 20th century, the picture kind of starts to change in a very negative way for railroads, because you have planes and you have cars and you have trucks. And then after, like by the 1950s, you have all this federal money going into the highway network. And suddenly railroads were in big financial trouble. Nobody, if you were going from New York to Chicago, very few people would get on a train anymore to do that. You can just hop on a plane or drive your own car or take a bus. So railroads became, a lot of railroads went bankrupt. And by the late 1960s, I think it was, the biggest railroad in the United States, which was the Penn Central, itself a product of a merger, that went bankrupt, and that was just huge national news, huge news for the economy. Because again, I believe it wasn't just the biggest railroad. I believe it was the largest corporation in the United States. There's a lot of kind of auxiliary history attached to that. Everybody knows the big bank Goldman Sachs. People think of them as very, powerful. They came this close to going bankrupt because of their exposure to Penn Central debt. Penn Central owed them a lot of money they couldn't pay back. So Goldman Sachs almost went bankrupt. So it was just a really big thing. So at that time, Congress and, even up at the very highest levels of government, the president even, we're trying to figure out, like, what do we do? We've got, this industry that is like losing all this money, and it employs so many people, and it's just, so important to the economies of these local places. So they actually came up with some, interesting policy, remedies. And they, won't go through them all, but, one of the big things they did was told the railroads that, okay, we'll take all this money losing passenger service away from you. We'll create this thing called Amtrak, and we'll do it ourselves. It'll be government owned. And then in addition, they deregulated the market. This was in 1980. There was a very, very important piece of legislation called the Staggers Act. And now after that, railroads were able to sort of chart, they had more flexibility on their pricing. So that allowed them to sort of get back on their feet. And then it didn't happen overnight, but eventually there were a bunch of mergers. And if we fast forward to today, railroads are extremely, extremely profitable. And I'm talking right now about the big ones, the class 1 railroads. And if I go to my next slide here, I have a list of most of the class. There's actually one missing here, and it's missing for a reason. I'll explain that in a second. But here are your big railroads. I included here, and I assume you can see this on my thing. It's I've got the Zoom boxes covering it, but I assume you can see Ferromex at the end. That's a Mexican railroad.
It's there. We can see it.
Cool. Awesome. So that's I just included that in there just so you can see. But the other class 1 railroads, you can see the 2 in Canada, Canadian National, Canadian Pacific. There's Union Pacific in the West. Now BNSF is missing for just a simple reason that they have not reported their 4th quarter results yet. They will do so, I believe, tomorrow. So if we were holding this one day later, this chart would have been a little different. But in any case, if anybody's curious, BNSF is pretty much, you can expect them to come. Do you notice how like all of these are just pretty close together? And these are operating ratios, by the way. This is something used. This is new to me because we don't use this in the airline industry. We use operating margin. Operating ratio, it's just a measure of profitability, and the lower, the better. So it just kind of tells you, like what portion of your revenue gets eaten up by expenses. So the lower, the better. And you can see Canadian National had a very good quarter last quarter. And there's a couple of different reasons for that. And, I don't want to go into each and every different railroad, but you can see they're all pretty close, and all these are very, very, very extremely good. They're very low numbers, which means these are very, you wouldn't see this in the airline industry. Let's put it that way. The airline industry is a lot less profitable than railroads. And one of the reasons is that, it is, as you can see, very consolidated. There's really only these big players that you can see here. And there's, slight variation. You can see Norfolk Southern is a little bit higher with that at that 64% level, still good, but a little bit higher. And, why are they higher? Not necessarily for a bad reason. I mean, Norfolk Southern is the one railroad that has the most exposure, that gets the greatest percentage of their revenues from the intermodal business, just transporting containers. And that business does tend to be a little bit less, the margins are lower. It can still be profitable, but it's just the less profitable. Whereas, something like coal or, exporting coal to Europe or something, that's going to be just more profitable. So, Norfolk Southern has that little challenge on trying to, when you do the horse race here, they're not always going to come out on top. But I don't think that's, super concerning. I have the full year 2022 numbers on here as well. And I guess, so BNSF, I don't have the fourth quarter yet, so I didn't put it on. But we always run this stuff in Railroad Weekly. That's my newsletter that I publish. I put it out every Sunday. And for sure, the one that goes out this Sunday will have the BNSF numbers as well. So you can, stay tuned for those. But that's just a brief look at the profitability of the different players. Now, there are other players. They're not the only railroads. So I just named, I just gave a few other stakeholders in the North American freight railroad industry. We have short line railroads. And again, I apologize. I know a lot of you are from the railroads, and I hope I'm not speaking to you like you're in kindergarten. That's not my intention. I just always know from my point of view, I always like, just in case there's someone out there that, there might be some people who are new to the industry like I was. So short lines, there's about 600 or 700 of them. And they just, it's kind of what the name implies. They tend to be, have shorter, smaller networks. And they work very closely with the class ones. They often do like the last mile service to and from the customer, but they're very, very important players. And, sometimes you'll occasionally see a class one railroad that buys a short line. We just saw one last year with CSX bought a railroad called Pan Am up in New England. That was a short line. So you'll see deals. You'll also see like this space also is kind of consolidated. There are a couple of big companies that, own as many as like 100 of these. There's, Watco and Genesee in Wyoming, I think is the name of perhaps the biggest one. They, own 100 of these short lines or something like that. So it's so those, and they're very important. And you can see there on the right, if anybody's wondering why I, slapped a picture of the Alabama map, that just shows you, I know you can't see it's too small to really see the who's who on the lines. But the thick lines are the class ones. I think that red line is at CSX. I can't see on my thing, but the purple line might be NS. I don't know. And then all those kind of, thinner lines they're the various short lines that run through the state of Alabama. I just use that as an example. And then, some other industry stakeholders. You have your suppliers, all the people that sell stuff to the railroads, whether it be, the locomotives, the rail cars, or the rail ties to, just technology. I think Andrew is one of those suppliers, so he knows about them. And then, of course, the shippers, the customers, the people who need the railroads. And then you have your intermodal partners, there's something called channel partners, different names. I'm still learning all the railroads have a lot of, a lot of terminology to learn. But these are, if you think a good example would be, JB Hunt, big trucking company that works very, very closely with the railroads. In their case, with BNSF and Norfolk Southern. So they're, very big players. You've got your regulators, your labor unions, the communities. You can see now with what's happening in Ohio, how the community, just very important to be engaged with the community. I mean, they're very big stakeholders. And the, Amtrak and the commuter rails as well. What's unique about North America is that the freight railroads tend to own most of the track. So Amtrak's, got to basically get their permission to, and there's laws that say what they can do, what they can't do. But in general, it's very different abroad where, in some I was, I don't know anything about the Indian railroad system, but they were talking today about how they're, the freight roads there are slowed down because the passenger rails get priority there. So some of you might know more about that, but in any case, that's just a quick look. All right, I'm going to divert my attention for a second from railroads just to talk about the economy. That's also something I follow very closely. In fact, as Andrew him and I used to do some work on a newsletter that we used to do a podcast together actually about the U.S. economy based on a newsletter that I used to do. I don't do it anymore, but I still follow the U.S. economy very closely. And it is a very, very interesting time. So, I know this is not an economics webinar here, but I can tell you that, this is what railroad executives are, constantly thinking about. How's the economy going to be this year? Is is our consumers going to be spending? Is there going to be a demand for export coal? Is there going to be, they're just constantly thinking about this. So I just wanted to share a little bit. I picked out 3 things, to be optimistic about the economy, 3 reasons that maybe, might not be so optimistic. So the big thing that everybody, the optimists point to is that the job market right now generally is very, very strong. Like the most recent jobs report that came out in January was like super hot. Everybody, was amazed at how many new jobs were created. And the, what is that going to slow down? Nobody really knows. But it's, unemployment rate is just very, very, very low right now. It's, jobs are available if you want one, pretty much, I'm speaking obviously very generally here, but throughout the economy. A lot of industries, even sometimes you read in the newspaper, the information technology industry is, Google is laying off all these people and this and that. Yes, but I can tell you the airlines are hiring, the hotels are hiring, the restaurants are hiring, the hospitals are hiring. So there's even a lot of, even the railroads are actually still hiring. So it is a very hot job market. Consumer spending. It's funny, I was listening to some railroad conference calls today, as I mentioned earlier, and they're starting to get worried about this, the consumer spending. So far, kind of mixed picture. They're spending on some things, they're spending on travel for sure. I can tell you that from the airline business. People are traveling like crazy, but they're not spending so much on a lot of the things that the railroads tend to move. And we'll talk about that more a little bit later. Maybe I can't remember his next slide or coming up, just kind of which things are good for the railroads, which things are not so good. But generally, I'd put that on the positive side still, that consumers are still spending. And then, like I said, there's a lot of large, portions of the economy that are still doing very, very well. I mentioned travel, but even agriculture. I listened to John Deere's earnings. I listen to a lot of earnings calls because you get tons of clues about the economy from that. I listened to John Deere, the tractor company. And they're saying, the U.S. and Canadian farm economies are very, very strong right now. And that's great for railroads. So those, 3 reasons to be happy. Now I'm going to depress you and give you 3 reasons why things might not be so great. So one is, I jokingly say, so the Federal Reserve, which some of you know is kind of the central bank to the United States, they're responsible for the money supply, very, very extremely influential government agency, and they I call it a license to kill. Basically, what I'm saying is that they have to worry each and every day when they get out of bed, is inflation going to get out of hand? Because inflation, the U.S. has not just the U.S., a lot of countries have bad history with inflation. It can really, really cause a lot of economic trouble. So when there's inflation, the Federal Reserve, the typical thing they do is they make it very expensive to borrow money, or more expensive to borrow money. And that's what they've been doing recently because inflation has been an issue. And because the job market, as I mentioned, is so hot, especially that January report, people think that the next time the Fed meets, they meet about 8 times a year, I think it is, every 6 weeks roughly. The next one, I believe, is it mid-March, late March? So people are starting to worry that, they're gonna hike interest rates again. They're gonna make it even more expensive to borrow, just to slow the economy, to get people to stop spending, and inflation prices to get to cool down a bit. Maybe I wouldn't say that they want unemployment. In fact, one of their mandates is actually they're supposed to maximize employment. They're supposed to enact policies that help employment, but inflation, they're worried about it. So, they may want to cool the job market off a little bit. So that's one reason that some people are worried. And that's that second point there about inflation, same thing. And then, the housing market is a big deal too, and this is very directly related to the Federal Reserve raising interest rates. As they started doing so last year, what was a very, very hot housing market suddenly started to cool off. And now it's basically frozen. I've been hearing that in the last couple of weeks, it's starting to pick up life a little bit. So we'll see. And housing, is it important to railroads? Well, Union Pacific says, they give you a quote. They said that 5% of their freight is tied to housing. So think of, lumber and, glass for the windows and things, things, housing, construction. That sounds a little bit low to me. I would think it'd be even a little bit higher because it's a lot of stuff that goes in that. But in any case, that gives you a sense. But rather, it's not only just the direct impact on railroads from housing, but, if housing is not strong, then, families start to feel wealthy, less wealthy, they don't spend as much. That affects the larger economy. So that can affect railroads sort of indirectly. So anyway, that's the housing. And then we mentioned, IT is information technology. I always say, keep an eye on energy prices. This may have been more true a few decades ago, but still, when oil prices go up a lot, that causes a lot of problems. It actually, in some regions of North America, it actually helps. In a place like, Texas or Calgary, places where they produce a lot of oil, export a lot of oil, it can be a good thing. But in general, when oil prices go very high, it tends to cause a lot of trouble for the economy. And that's another discussion. But anyway, I hope I didn't take too much of your time diverting that. Let's go back to a railroad discussion. So here is North American rail traffic in 2022, last year. And you can see that by carloads, and just remember there's a difference between carloads and revenue. Carloads, we're talking about volume. So intermodal, the boxes, you can see it's like really about half of all the traffic that they carry. So it's become, and this is, kind of been the growth engine for the railroads over the past decade or so. Although frankly, it hasn't really grown much. I can't see, what is that number there? Whoops, I have, it's covering my screen anyway. But intermodal hasn't really been growing, and it's kind of shrinking at the start of 2023. And that's a little bit of a concern because railroads, they're under a lot of pressure to grow, pressure from a lot of different stakeholders. So if intermodal doesn't grow, it makes that job much tougher. So we'll see. You can see how big coal still is. Now, coal is, coal is not, that's not the future, it's the past. And everybody in the railroad, every railroad executive will tell you that we can't, it got a little bit of bump in 2022. It had a good year. And it's still okay in 2023 because energy markets are really tight for a time, and this is changing, but for a time, natural gas prices are very high. So, two common ways that you produce electricity is either you burn the coal, or you burn the natural gas. So when natural gas was really expensive, more and more of these power plants turned to coal, and that was great for railroads because, the natural gas that moves through pipelines and stuff. So that doesn't really help railroads much, but coal, that was very helpful. And you see chemicals, a big deal. And this will vary by railroads. So like CSX, for example, chemicals is that's like their number one revenue segment is chemicals for CSX. Canadian Pacific up in Canada, they're very, very bulk oriented. So when I say bulk, like very commodities, the grains and and they're less coal, but coal is considered bulk. But also fertilizer, potash, things like that. Very, very big for Canadian Pacific, even to a certain extent Canadian National. And that stuff is doing, pretty well right now. I think we'll talk about that in a slide coming up here. And yeah, later if we do if you have any questions about any of these categories, different railroads categorizing them differently. You might put grain in another bigger category with all agricultural products, or, this is not, this is just from the AAR, which has great data on this sort of stuff. This is how they categorize it. And that's where I'm getting this data from. So, but you can see last year, the total rail freight in volume terms actually shrank. So, remember I said the railroads really want to grow, and a lot of people are pressuring them to grow, but they didn't do it last year. And one of the big reasons for that is not so much economic, was that their service kind of was crappy. If I can use, that's the technical term for it. I said I wasn't an, operations technical person, but no, just kidding. It was bad. The service was bad. So, and the reason for that, different people will tell you different things. Some blame it on this precision scheduled railroading idea, which we can talk about later if you want the Q&A. But what happened, I think it's important to know this basic idea. So when COVID hit, when the COVID crisis first hit in early 2020, everybody thought the world was going to fall apart. And it did, the economy did fall apart for about a month or two. And railroads reacted by furloughing a lot of employees. And they had already, even before that, were furloughing employees because of PSR. Again, separate subject, but a new round of furloughs after COVID. And then suddenly the economy came back rather quickly. And there was all this demand, especially like if you think about the intermodal stuff. You remember how like all of us, after, sort of the end of 2020, we all started like buying stuff online and, ordering Peloton bikes. I never bought one of those. I don't know if you guys did, but in any case, that's always the metaphor. Like everybody's buying Peloton bikes or whatever it was, furniture. They were going to Home Depot and doing this, that, ordering stuff. A lot of the stuff was built in China, shipped over to the port of Los Angeles or Long Beach, put on a train to Chicago, distributed, to everywhere in the US. And eventually, Amazon would bring it to our house or whatever. But that just came back really fast. And the railroads didn't have the labor to deal with it. So then they went back and said, okay, let's recall these people on furlough. And a lot of them didn't come back because the job market was so tight. So you can get a job at an Amazon warehouse and wherever, and a lot of alternative jobs. And in some cases, these jobs were, they were less taxing in terms of you didn't have to be away from your family for long stretches of time. More set work schedules and things like that. So that's kind of work schedule is a big issue even today with the railroads. Currently, that's a big thing. So they, so that's like, they were just caught flat-footed. They didn't have enough labor. And that kind of lasted really up until, it's still a problem for some railroads today. The Eastern railroads tend to be, sounds like they've got their act together now, more or less. Union Pacific out west, I don't know, they seem to, pretty recently, they were still embargoing a lot of traffic, saying, we can't handle it. They've also, obviously there's been weather issues too, that severe weather that, especially out west, that some have to deal with. From what I understand, there's some severe weather going on right now. I don't know if any of you are affected by it, but I was talking to a airline colleague today in Michigan and said they were buried in snow. So hope you guys are, safe and sound. But moving on. So and basically I didn't go to the slide, but everything I just said, but basically that's what this slide addresses. So I'm going to move on. Now for 2023, just as I said, the economy is kind of a mixed outlook. Well, the railroad, kind of freight demand, it's a mixed outlook here too. And we don't have to go through every single one of these, but you can see I mentioned that, most of the bulk traffic is pretty decent still. Canada had like a really awesome grain harvest, a very bad one the year before, and this year it's like very good. So that's helping, the Canadian National, Canadian Pacific out a lot. Coal, as I mentioned, is still good, but, I think that party may be coming to an end pretty soon. We'll see. Auto production. That was another industry, by the way, just like the railroads, they kind of got caught flat-footed. They closed a lot of assembly plants when COVID first hit, and suddenly everybody wanted to buy cars and they couldn't make enough. They couldn't get enough semiconductors for the cars and blah, blah, blah. And, but now that's starting to recover. So that's good for the railroads. As I mentioned, the service is getting better. This nearshoring thing is very interesting. Been reading a lot more about that, about how, companies. So in 2000, starting in about 2000, China joined the World Trade Organization, completely revolutionized how the US economy works. So the US economy just became heavily dependent on basically producing things in Asia, particularly China. And because containerized shipping is so cheap, they were able to kind of use that as a production base and then move things by ship and by rail and by truck to the end consumer in the US. So I like to say, every time you just walk into a Walmart and just pick something up and everything is made in China, which is amazing. I mean, Walmart is America's biggest importer, and that's because it imports so much from not just China, but, overseas in Asia where the labor costs are much cheaper. So that's Walmart. And then now that party's kind of coming to an end, for better or for worse. Part of the reason was because the supply chains were broken, as a lot of you know, during COVID, and people are now kind of prioritizing, when we say reliability rather than, efficiency. Maybe it costs a little more, but we'd rather have it, I think, what do you hear them say, like just in case rather than just in time inventory approach. So that is starting to change. I mean, I wouldn't overplay it. I mean, there's still, a very big part of the economy, a very big part of what we buy today as Americans, as Canadians, as, wherever you might, I don't know if we have people from outside this region, but a lot of that stuff still comes from Asia, East Asia, but more of that stuff is being nearshored or onshored, either in the US or increasingly in Mexico. And that's great for the railroads, especially if you're like Kansas City Southern, which owns a Mexican railroad. And as you may know, Canadian Pacific is trying to buy Kansas City Southern. And one of the reasons why they want that is because they see a lot of growth in Mexico. And one of the reasons why they see a lot of growth in Mexico is because of this nearshoring thing I'm talking about. So a phenomenon to watch closely, and you hear more and more people talk about it. Wall Street Journal just ran an article about this like 2 or 3 days ago. So it's on people's minds. I'm just going to be mindful of time here. I want to leave time for questions. So I'm not going to go through too much more of this other than to say the intermodal market is weakening, housing market is weakening. We kind of talked about that already. Any kind of like forestry products, paper, lumber, it's weak, chemicals weakening. So you can see it's kind of a mixed picture. I'm going to move on. And then I kind of mentioned about the growth, the sort of the growth mandate that railroads have. And can you do that with, coal kind of becoming less and less important in the economy? And if intermodal is not growing, then, how do you grow? And there are, we can talk about in the Q&A, there are ways, but it just becomes a little bit harder. And there's actually, I put some of the ways on here. They say that demand's going to grow with service and, the nearshoring, offshoring, et cetera. So a few more topics that I just put on here because they're things that, that come up all the time. We mentioned precision scheduled railroading. This is just a new, well, not so really new anymore, but it was kind of a concept pioneered, I don't know, decade and a half ago, whatever it was. I put the copy out. There's a great book if you're interested in railroad, kind of recent railroad history. Hunter Harrison, who is some of you know, very controversial figure in the railroad industry, who kind of ushered in this precision scheduled railroading thing, created enormous efficiency gains, enormous profitability gains, but some argue, at the expense of a lot of workers, arguably at the expense of reliability. I mean, railroads will argue the other way, but the very interesting thing to read about, to think about. There's that merger any day now, and to say any week now, probably I'd say first week of March, look for the Surface Transportation Board, that's the regulator in Washington, to make a decision on whether or not they're going to allow Canadian Pacific to buy Kansas City Southern. I think most people think they will. Maybe they'll attach some conditions like, you got to sell off this line to someone else or something. So that's hot and in the news. Crew sizes, technologies, staffing strategies. You'll hear, this is the question every railroad would get at every investor conference currently is, if the economy does sour, if it turns down, are you going to lay off employees? Are you going to start furloughing employees again? And they're all saying, no, not this time. We learned our lesson. But we'll see what happens. Changing the guard just refers to a lot of the class 1 railroads, like almost all of them, have new chief executive officers appointed just in the past, in some cases in the past couple of months. So that's what that refers to. And then, there's, some people think there's going to be more short line consolidation. So we can move to questions. I hope I left enough time. I'm happy to stay a little bit later, and I always encourage you guys, to reach out to me, email me. I love to talk about. I actually love to hear from you too, especially if you're, if you're someone on the operations side or have any really good insight on what's happening, higher. Please reach out. I love to chat. I love to talk. So there's my contact information, my email, and then that's that Railroad Weekly Substack. That's where you can see my newsletter. It is subscription based, but just email me for details on that. And then I also write about airlines. So I listed the relevant sites there. The company that I actually work full time is called Skift, which you can check out. They don't do any kind of freight thing. It's a travel, obviously consumer travel, but travel. So they do they cover airlines, hotels, and so check that out as well. And then Econ Weekly is defunct, but it's still up there if you want to check it out and read about old articles about the U.S. economy. And please follow me on LinkedIn as well. I don't post stuff as much as I would like, but occasionally I throw some stuff up there about the railroads or the economy or whatever, about airlines. So I think I spoke enough. So I'm going to turn it back to Andrew, who can moderate or host the questions if there are any.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Jay. And I'll let you take a drink of water because I'm sure you need one after that. Quite a soliloquy. Listen, thank you so much. We gave you a tough brief in trying to cover an entire industry in about 35 minutes. And I thought that was a really useful kind of context from the history right through in terms of kind of what really North American freight is all about. So thank you so much. We have a few questions coming in. One of them you've just answered, which was about the CP KCS merger. I just kind of having a look. So I'll take the first one I can see here from Ellen. So it said in the 2023 Outlook slide, you mentioned the 3C tailwind for intermodal. What is that?
Oh, yeah. Okay, 3C tailwind for intermodal. So that refers to what the railroads will tell you, and let's see if I can remember all 3 Cs. But what they'll tell you is that even though intermodal right now is having a little bit of a rough patch because of, as I said, the consumer economy, people are buying fewer Pelotons, and there's less stuff moving around coming in from China, whatnot. They still say that there are advantages, and they call them the 3C advantages. So one is the cost. It can be cheaper depending on, especially on very long journeys. If you're moving freight very long distances, the containers can be, the rail can be cheaper than shipping by truck, for example, or another alternative. The other C is carbon, so it's more environmentally friendly. And what was the third C? I may have to get back to you on it. Cost, carbon, and it'll probably come to me at some point. But anyway, I'll have to get back to you on it. But they're arguing that the idea here is they're arguing that even though we're seeing momentary weakness in intermodal, there's still like a lot of long-term potential there. Yep. So
okay. I was gonna give you some suggestions. It can't be convenience, but it might be capacity.
Andrew got it. It's capacity. And sorry, remember that guy who was it in the debates a couple of years ago? He forgot to on stage. I was like that guy, but he forgot the third thing. So yeah, it's capacity. So they're saying that because you have these like very long trains, you could just move a lot of stuff, whereas you can't move you can't move huge volumes of coal on a truck. It just doesn't work. So that's what it is. Yeah, capacity, carbon, and cost.
Okay, so I'm just going to jump in with the question I'd got. So we did speak a lot about the US economy and the US railroads. I know you referenced Canadian National, Canadian Pacific obviously operate throughout the US as well. But is there anything specific about the Canadian market or even the Mexican one that is worth kind of making a note of?
Yeah, so we can talk about Canada first. So Canada is a lot of the trends are similar to the US trends. I mean, obviously the economies are so deeply integrated. Now, one thing, as I mentioned, or I alluded to anyway, is that the Canadian economy is very commodity heavy. So huge, export of oil and gas, energy, Potash is a huge thing. Anything to do with like agricultural sector stuff. So the Canadian economy is a little bit more commodity oriented than the U.S. as a whole. So keep that in mind when you're thinking about that. Like I remember when I was covering the airline industry back in like the mid 2000s, let's say the early 2010, sorry, oil prices were really, really high. And the airline industry was having a difficult time with it. But one market, interestingly, that did very well was Calgary and Alberta, because there was so much money getting, just because that's what they do there. They export oil. Same thing with Houston, by the way. Houston is the oil capital of the United States. Calgary is the oil capital of Canada. So, keep that in mind. But in general, yeah, I mean, the economies are very closely linked. So they're, the Canadian carriers are still also seeing the same kind of intermodal weakness. Very similar there. Now, I don't want to get too much in. One interesting difference is in the housing market. So in the US, the mortgage rates here tend to be fixed over 30 years. So if you've got, my wife and I are very lucky. We've got a mortgage, just by luck, we got a mortgage a couple of years ago. We locked in a very low rate. So we've got that rate for 30 years. We don't have to worry about it. In Canada, so that's that's very helpful. That's, very common across the US. So a lot of households are not feeling that pressure from the higher mortgage rates. Whereas in Canada, they tend to be, some of you may know this more than others, some of you may hold a Canadian mortgage, but those mortgages tend to be a shorter duration. So, every 3 years, every 4 years, they might readjust, and then the household will have to go out and get a higher cost mortgage, and that will, affect their ability to spend on other stuff, and it could hurt. So just, something to keep in mind. Okay. Yeah. Oh, in Mexico, so this nearshoring, onshoring is a big deal. Mexico also a lot of oil, a lot of agricultural trade. Canadian Pacific talks a lot about what it wants to do with Kansas City Southern. So one thing is, it wants to move more, fresh vegetables from Mexico up north, and perhaps some industrial. And then one of the biggest, for the railroad's perspective, one of the biggest things going on in Mexico is the auto assembly. So you have stuff just constantly going back and forth across the border. There might be a part built in St. Louis, and it goes down to some factory in Guadalajara or Monterrey, and they'll assemble it there, and then it'll cross the border again, and someone else in some factory in Memphis will add something, and then it will go back to Detroit, and they'll do the final assembly, or the final assembly might be done in Mexico. So there's a lot of auto stuff moving back and forth. And the auto industry is very interesting right now, because we're undergoing this just epic transition from these ICE vehicles, internal combustion engine vehicles, to battery powered vehicles. I mean, and you just have to build entirely new factories. So you see, like, all across the United States, certainly, like especially the Southeast United States, and even the Midwest, places like Detroit that we're losing a lot of factory jobs. You're seeing these announcements for these like new $1 billion factories. It's kind of cool, actually. Now, to what extent will it just merely replace the old factory, and so you don't get a net gain in job? I don't know, but a lot of activity.
Okay, thank you, Jay. So Jay, there's a couple of more questions I'd like to try and fit in without going too far over the time. So whilst on the subject of Mexico, the question is theft or pilferage claims a problem that gets reported in Mexico?
Yeah, I don't have anything to add about that other than what I've read, just kind of read probably the same things that you have. I think it has been an issue. There's also been labor unrest. I know KCS, I think, and maybe Union Pacific with Ferromex, I think they've had some issues not too long ago with, big strikes where they actually shut down the railroad. I think, was it a teacher strike? But I don't really, I apologize, I don't really have too much to add on that, other than, yeah, I mean, security, it's something that the railroads have to think about. And it's true. I mean, even I know they were having, do you guys remember in Los Angeles, I think it was, there was a lot of high profile coverage of things getting stolen, Amazon packages getting stolen out of train yards and things like that. So yeah, I mean, it is a factor. Now, is it does it move the needle in terms of profitability? Not really. I mean, it doesn't, but it's, yeah, I mean, it's definitely an issue.
Okay, yeah, and I'll just add one thing about Mexico, for those that don't know. So Ferromex, I think you referenced in terms of the slide as kind of being like an additional Class 1 railroad, but people should remember that KCS, especially, but also, you know, UP and BNSF kind of have operations within Mexico. So that is actually forms part of their network. So the Mexican rail actual environment is very interesting, kind of is quite international.
Yeah, and that's going to be a big battle, by the way. If this KCS CP goes through, you know, Union Pacific, they're big in Mexico, and they talk about it all the time. Like they want to, you know, keep their market share. That's going to be a big battle. So yeah, stay tuned.
So we'll now come to Luke's question. So do you have any statistics on railroad demographics, thinking about their ability to attract youngsters to join the industry?
I don't have any statistics, at least not off the top of my head. It has been an issue though. And I think now the question is it an issue? You know, the question is, why is it an issue? Is it just because the job market is so tight right now? You know, in some of these places, I mean, if you go, I think, who was it? I don't know if it was probably Union Pacific talking about like up in Montana, in some of these places, you know, the Pacific Northwest, it's just impossible to find workers. So maybe if unemployment, you know, if the labor markets loosen up a little bit and you have a higher unemployment, maybe that problem kind of solves itself. We just don't know. And I think it's a problem, not just for railroads, but really across the whole economy. I mean, it's there. I mean, you hear it all the time in airlines can't find enough pilots. Restaurants can't find enough waiters. I mean, there's not enough nurses. There's not enough truck drivers. There's not enough, it just goes on and on. So I think that just kind of remains to be seen, you know.
Yeah. Okay. You hedged that answer really, but
yeah, I don't have any specific. I mean, contact me. Maybe we can come up with something.
Yeah.
You know,
yeah. I mean, it's. I guess I think one of the things, Jay, to say is that if it's things that are being spoken about by the executives, whether in those analyst calls or what the bankers and the owners are asking them, or what they want to present externally, that's the kind of the headlines that you have. I guess if they're not talking about it, they're not seeing it either as a major issue, or they don't want to share kind of what they're doing. It kind of maybe classed as a little bit of a differentiating advantage, secret sauce. So
yeah, and to be clear, no, I mean, and to be clear, like definitely, I mean, recruiting new young talent. I mean, the railroads have been able to hire. I mean, they've hired thousands of people over the past. They've hired back some of the people, but they've hired a lot of, new people, young people. They've done a lot of that. So it does, but they will tell you that it's harder. And that's kind of comes back to my point of, the question of whether or not that's just more about the labor market as it exists today, or is it more about something, something social? Maybe, there's, there are issues with workforce participation rates have gone down in a lot of places across the United States in particular. So yeah, I mean, those are super interesting questions. And no, I don't really have any, answers or hard statistics on it, but it is something that executives in the railroad industry absolutely think about.
That sounds like a study area for either some of our students or more advanced academics, because, how much of it is geographic? Is it just the job market itself? So, Jay, we are now over our time, so we'll probably have to bring this to a close now. So I will thank you again for taking the time. It's really been a useful discussion, and thank you again for allowing us to kind of keep this. So this recording will be available on CILT's YouTube channel. We will get in touch with everybody after this, give you a copy of these slides. And again, we'll introduce, we'll give you the information about joining CILT or finding out more information about us. So with that, I'll thank everybody for giving up this time this evening. I hope everybody found that valuable and useful. Please share your feedback in terms of this event or anything else that you'd like to see. So good evening, good night, everybody. And we'll see you again on the next one. Thank you.
Thanks all.